Hello and welcome to the next lecture, lecture number 37 on a very interesting topic, the various kinds of indigenous responses to the domination of Western medicine. And we already saw the continuing attitude of the colonial state and especially the practitioners of Western medicine, so that increasingly condescending and patronizing attitude, and so that was not to go without its corresponding responses and reactions and contestations. So now these kinds of reactions came not only from the practitioners of alternative systems, the indigenous systems, but also from public figures, leaders and the press, because as I said, so now in the background, the spirit of nationalism has been building up. So all that is also aligned to this quest for establishing the status of the indigenous system. So again, like rising nationalism, parallelly there was this increase in Hindu revivalism, Hindu pride, and of course the colonial state also had always done its bit to keep those kinds of passions and fire alive, divides between Muslims and Hindus, and particular pride in the religion. And then Ayurveda, for instance, was seen as a direct and long-standing continuous heritage from ancient Aryans. And also indigenous medicine was seen very culturally more appropriate, and all of this is in the to show that how the enveloping spirit of nationalism, cultural nationalism, or religious identity, and political nationalism of all of them had their effect. So coming to the medical part as such, so the some of the practitioners of Western medicine even used very creatively used the tropical paradigm, which we saw as one of the new and emerging paradigms. So that itself was used as an argument. So they said if there are tropical diseases which are very specific to the tropics, then the medicaments or the remedies which are available in the tropics, so they will be more suited for those kinds of so-called tropical diseases. And also underlining the point that Western medicine, on the contrary, is developed in alien cultural conditions of temperate Europe, so they may not be all that suited to what are called tropical diseases. And the purists, those who didn't want any kind of compromise with other systems, they wanted strict adherence to Ayurvedic fundamental principles like the three dosha, the three humors, and they also wanted to maintain the whatever nomenclature and anatomical and other terms as it was existing. And they also went on the offensive, so they were not only defending their own systems, they also went on the offensive and attacked Western medicine as being too much dependent on external technology. And they also call the Western practitioners as catalog people, because there's just too many catalogs for medicine catalogs, and every time referring to that catalog. And in fact, they also went on to advise the practitioners of Western medicine that you should learn Sanskrit, and you should first of all fully understand before you criticize others, our system. So you should try first to learn our system. So that way you will also fully appreciate the value, and then you can go ahead and criticize. But before that, take some time to read what is there and learn Sanskrit also to do that. But so all of them were not entirely opposed or on the offensive like that. So some versions of the revitalization movement favored creative absorption of Western medicine respects which can be very fruitfully borrowed and used. So they felt that nothing was wrong in borrowing or learning from outside. In fact, they felt it was rather a responsibility to continue to be learning, interrogating, and adding adding to the existing stock of knowledge, even if it involved borrowing. So some of the advocates called for the reformation of their indigenous system and borrowing from other systems. So that's also, even before you borrow, there should be also reformation. First you reform, so clear especially some of the weeds, as we will see, and then also be open to accept ingredients like, for instance, particular medical substances like quinine, or borrow some practices from Western tradition of anatomy or pharmacology or diagnostics, or use particular instruments like thermometers, stethoscope, which many indigenous practitioners started using. And of course, later on, they even were in favor of shelf medicine, because otherwise, most of the indigenous systems followed customized medicine, so which was not already there, kept and made and kept in the shelf and ready to be just dispensed. So it's only after meeting the patient, talking in a very intimate way and understanding. It's only after that, in front of the patient, or if not in front of the patient, it is after the talking, the medicine was prepared specifically for that particular person, for that condition. But so now, with the changing times, the indigenous practitioners were very open for kind of commercial production, and putting them in dispensaries and pharmacies, and also even this culture of setting up hospitals and dispensaries, appointments and all that, so which will actually be discussed in detail in another lecture. But coming to the contestations, so they contested some of the repeated name callings and stereotypings, as the system is crude, it's marked by blind empiricism, it's unscientific, not very open to change, all those kinds of repeated things. So these were now very vigorously contested, and the practitioner of indigenous medicine called for proper treatment. Treat us properly, there should be mutual respect. So there can't be that kind of condescending, patronizing attitude. So we should treat others with respect, and we should work on equal terms. And one of the things that they were very conscious, the indigenous practitioners was very conscious, was the importance of state support and patronage for any scientific endeavor, for any endeavor, artistic or any endeavor, as we all know through history. So there should be money has to come, and more than money is also kind of encouragement given by the state. And so they particularly, for instance, also noted at least the Unani system had that patronage for the few centuries before this, because of the presence of Muslim rulers. So they felt, Ayurvedic practitioners felt particularly the lack of this patronage over many centuries now. So that was very important, and that's why now, of course, the only state, of course, there was this nationalist movement, but then at that given point, that was the state which was available, and whatever the kind of state, the state support was needed. So they constantly appealed to the state for its proper support and its recognition. And simultaneously, even as they were contesting, as they were appealing to the colonial state, and as they were contesting vis-a-vis the state-supported Western system of medicine, so there was also something of what we can call sub-hegemony. So they were also trying to kind of dominate or judge various other sub-systems or local systems, say for instance tribal and other folk traditions, which they called. So these leading lights of the revitalization movement, so even as they were strengthening and tightening their particular systems, so they felt there are others relatively which are indigenous, but which don't measure up to their practices, indigenous practices. So there was also that process. So many others indigenous practices called by these people, indigenous practitioners, as superstitious and quackery, just as the practitioners of Western medicine called Ayurveda Unani practitioners as quacks. Just as in Ayurveda, so Unani also had its own revivalism. So Unani is a system of medicine brought to India by the Muslims. It is an Arab-based system. So it, as I said, had the support of the Muslim rulers, and therefore, when that rule declined, the patronage also declined, and therefore there was a need for bringing it back. And this movement, in this case, Unani was excuse me, spearheaded by Hakim Hajmal Khan, who was a son of a celebrated physician. So this revival movement was centered around the Madrasa Tibia in Delhi, of which he took charge in 1889. So Ajmal Khan went about doing several things. So one was to collect and systematize traditional medical knowledge, because the whole point was about making this appear as tight, as neat, as respectable as possible, especially in the light of these being termed as quackery, disorganized, diffuse, and all that. So, in both cases, in Ayurveda as well as we see this constant effort. So, we will see in some other lectures also to basically collect and accept certain things as right texts and to systemize both the codification as well as the practice also. So, in the process, weed off unqualified tabibs, that is doctors, who it was felt did harm to the system and eventually to the people and patients, and also weed off what were considered as unnecessary accretions, additions to what was the proper system or the proper text, and removing these unqualified tabibs, in their place produce properly qualified practitioners with rigorous training in Unani diagnostics, pharmacology, and also in practical anatomy and surgery. So these are all ways of making things clear, systematic, not only the knowledge part but also the training also, so that no one can just consider them as pushovers being done in a very disorganized way. So, and he was also open to internal dialogue with Ayurveda and to incorporate aspects of Ayurvedic system as part of his reforming of Unani. And in fact, he named the college itself now from just Unani to Ayurvedic and Unani TB College. But of course, the majority of the students who went there were Muslims. And as could be expected, he earned the displeasure of the traditionalists and conservatives who were more for a purist stand, so they didn't want any kind of compromise with other things. Of course, as we saw, he himself was actually very dedicated to the kind of the tightening of the system, but that is eradicating what he thought were not proper canonical works. But he was open to others, but that was not liked by the purists. But nevertheless, one good thing is that though the Mughal rule was gone, so there's still a nobility like the Nawabs of Rampur and Dhaka. So he had their support, and as well as the Muslim elite, and also to for his cause with the state, to advance the cause of the system in terms of state recognition and support. So he used another different route, different argument. So to highlight how this has some commonality with Western medicine itself, because Unani also was built upon the Greek tradition by the Arabs. So there is that the original founding point, originating point that Greek connection. So that was highlighted. So the state should, the state is exposing Western medicine, so has some kind of a reason to support, and that also ensured the rationalism coming from the Greeks. So now, so we'll delve a little more into that connection between revivalism and nationalism. So, as I said, the rising nationalism cast its shadows, long shadows, on the medical revival movements. So, earlier the quest was, the IMS was to white centered. In fact, it was very racist, it was very exclusive. So, one of the main concerns of the nationalist camp was to get more Indians into IMS. IMS itself should become more Indian in nature. There should be adequate representation, all that. So, that, which means that so it's a direct acceptance of the Western system of medicine. So, what was asked was a greater place for Indians inside that Western system of medicine, not only in IMS, but generally across the board in the colonial medical structure, better place for Indians. So, from 1920s onwards, the Indian National Congress in its annual meetings, which used to be held every year around December in different places, passing several resolutions, and from 1920s there were resolutions specifically on excuse me, the importance and relevance and the usefulness of indigenous systems of medicine, particularly Ayurveda and Unani. So, the national movement called for the establishment of schools and colleges and hospitals for both the teaching and as well as treatment in accordance with indigenous systems. And also now the healthcare, the colonial healthcare infrastructure was dominated by the Western system. So, there was a call for inclusion of Ayurveda and Unani also into that. So, that is again another way of earning the legitimacy and the status. And it also called for the licensing and registration of indigenous practitioners and proper recognition of Indian systems, because this licensing is another way of gaining as well as granting legitimacy. So, the native newspapers also played a very important part. So, they, along with the nationalist leaders, projected Ayurveda as a national symbol, and advancement of indigenous medicine was not just about some kind of an epistemological struggle to get the rightful place for a particular kind of knowledge system. So, this is also a matter of national pride and also national duty. And they also highlighted that in the context of the First World War, now 1914 to 18, there was a shortage of medical officers, because many of the people who were here had to be diverted to the war front, and also the drugs coming from outside, so they became more costly because of the conditions of the war. And so, therefore, now with the time sees so many factors coming together. So, both the nationalist politics as well as international affairs. So, how so this again goes to say how several factors, political, cultural and religious, go to the shaping of medicine, medical policies, medical quests, contestations and all that. So, now so all of these were added reasons for the state to promote indigenous practitioners as well as the drugs. And also again the same fact remains that 90% of the Indian population was still dependent on indigenous medicine. So, it is all the more incumbent on the state to support that kind of medical systems. And another interesting thing, which we have not talked much about, is that the princely states, as I told in a couple of lectures, the princely states, though they accepted the suzerainty and pledged of the British and pledged their loyalty to the colonial state, they were allowed to run their affairs pretty much independent, especially the general administration, including medicine and health care. So many of these princely states, like the princely state of Travancore or Mysore, so they had very commendable healthcare infrastructure generally. So they also were not, so just because they were princely states and run by local princes, kings, did not mean that they were averse to Western system. In fact, they very eagerly, for instance, the state of Travancore very enthusiastically welcomed missionaries to come and set up specially medical missions, establishing hospitals and all that. So on the one hand, so they were very, so these were called very progressive princely states. So they were given that certificate, but simultaneously they also encouraged indigenous systems by establishing hospitals, dispensaries, and also providing scholarships to students to pursue training in indigenous systems. So the nationalists were pointing out how that's possible. So in fact, so both are possible. So the same government can simultaneously give importance and patronage to both. And coming back to the British India, the Government of India Act of 1919, this, as we have seen a couple of other lectures, opened new opportunities for possible patronage of indigenous medicine. So these kinds of acts like Government of India Act 1909, 1990, 1935, so these are like acts of concession in response to the rising nationalist spirit. So they could not be remaining entirely inured to these kinds of demands and petitions. So this particular act, also called as the Montague-Chelmsford Act, provided for some measure of self-government to Indians, and this was the same act which provided for the diarchy, and which the provincial government had considerable control over local issues like health, education, roads, and agriculture, these kinds of transferred subjects. So through this process of devolution, so the administration of health came under the purview of Indian ministers. So this was a real opportunity for Indians now sitting as ministers to support Indian systems now from within. So all these days they were petitioning and proclaiming and claiming from outside. So now they had some little leeway. So for instance, they could have some say in the allocation of funds or other means, like for instance, setting up committees to study. So in fact, one such committee was the Usman committee, which was set up in the Madras presidency. So this was to investigate indigenous medicine. So the actual name of the committee is the Committee on Indigenous Systems of Medicine. This was appointed in October 1921 with Muhammad Usman as the chairman, and he was a part-time Hakim. So the objectives, as given in the original text, was to afford the exponents of the Ayurvedic and Unani systems an opportunity to state their case in writing for scientific criticism and to justify state encouragement to these systems. So this was a proper forum where they could argue, they can state their case very clearly. And an important member of this committee was its very secretary, which was Srinivasa Murthy, who was Ayurvedic practitioner and who kept the committee's attention particularly on Ayurveda. And so he was someone who was very much against using Ayurveda just as a source for extracting drugs, useful drugs to be incorporated into the Western state-based, Western medicine-based state system, which was what was the trend to just incorporate and try to avoid recognition as a system. So that was one trend of thought among the practitioners of Western medicine or the state establishment in general. And he was also someone who belonged to the broadly to the purist line, so he wasn't very much for compromise. And he wanted Ayurveda to have its own clear, autonomous, and rightful place. He wasn't too much for syncretism or any kinds of accommodation or too much of borrowing. So the committee, based on testimony from physicians of the local traditions, of different traditions, concluded that, so this is again quoting from the committee's report, from the standpoint of science, the Indian systems are strictly logical and scientific, and from the standpoint of art, that is practice, they are not self-sufficient at present, especially in the surgical line. Though in the medical line, they are generally speaking quite self-sufficient, efficient, and economical. So this was a considerable gain for the movement, revitalization movements. So the committee also recommended the establishment of a college for Indian medicine at Madras, with that the main school will be in Madras, the capital of the presidency, but there will be divisional schools in specified centers in each linguistic area, because the Madras presidency had people speaking different languages. So there were the Telugu speaking areas, there were the Malayalam speaking areas, Tamil speaking areas. So accordingly, the language, the concerned language will be introduced in the particular divisional school or college of Indian medicine. And what did the committee have to say on the role of the indigenous systems in public health itself? So it recommended that the government should enable local bodies and private agencies to establish and run indigenous medicines based dispensaries and hospitals. So they should be part of the mainstream health infrastructure. And so we were talking about the setting up of a college of indigenous medicine. So this was set up in 1924, the School of Indigenous Medicine. And the government also allowed local bodies to open indigenous medical dispensaries and hospitals, recruiting indigenous medical practitioners. So what was recommended was all not just standing in just as recommendations. So soon the school is started. So soon we have dispensaries actually started. So the change in the government policy can be attributed to the, among other things, to the compulsion to expand its public health measures. So that was a huge challenge, especially with the epidemics and also with the new World War related compulsions. But so in the face of that, all the earlier doubts about the scientific validity of the indigenous systems seem to stand aside. Actually, we can't even say that, because the committee also, at least in a few places, specifically stated that it is scientific. So in certain areas they do have merit and all that. So but of course, other more important reasons are, as we have been seeing, the rising tide of public opinion and the nationalistic fervor. And as could be expected, the report earned the anger and anguish of those in the state medical establishment. They continue to remain unconvinced of all the arguments made in favor of the indigenous systems by the Usman committee. They rather saw the report as a kind of nationalist ranting propaganda, a diatribe. But all said and done, there's one important thing which is generally not talked about when people talk about the Usman Committee report, which is the building of a new identity around the Siddha system. The Siddha system is generally understood as an assemblage of practices from ancient times in the Tamil-speaking regions of southern India, with its own exponents, that is the genealogy of Siddhas, with its own medical principles and drugs, especially mercury and particular ores. While this is true, but actually in practice till about the 1920s, most of the practitioners worked under the broad umbrella of Ayurveda. with the growing prospects of state patronage on the horizon, as was seen through the setting up of the Usman Committee, there was now the growing concern and anxiety among the Tamil speakers, those who saw themselves as practitioners of Siddha in particular, that all of those benefits might accrue mostly to Ayurveda and Unani. And within Ayurveda, there was that rising concern about the processes of standardization and the strengthening of the Sanskritic content at the cost of the more local Tamil content. So now this Usman Committee hearings also served as a fruitful and useful forum for the expression of these concerns and that kind of a internal fight for the assertion of the Siddha identity. So based on organized and concerted efforts and testimonies, so for instance, all these Tamil medical practitioners, so they networked and communicated among themselves, and they had a clear strategy that these are the kinds of responses to be given to the kinds of questionnaires circulated by the Usman Committee. There should be some uniformity in what we say, and so that kind of a concerted effort was there, and so all of this succeeded in establishing a distinct Siddha space and identity within the mainstream indigenous system. So this again goes to buttress the point that we made at the beginning of the lecture about the very nomenclatures. So indigenous was not just indigenous, it's not something which we can take it very easily, unproblematically, and even such a complicated thing as within Ayurveda, the emergence of a new identity, which ironically comes out of this very fight against something else. So these are important nuances which we should keep in mind, and some of them which we will revisit in a couple of other lectures, and we will close this one at this. Thank you.